Alright, we are now ready to begin taking a look at the song editor for our game. Now, before we jump into the editor itself, there's a little bit of foundational work that needs to be put together in order to house the edit mode here inside of our game.
A bunch of little tasks we have to get done before we can start working on the editor in earnest.
Of course, we have the basics of things like settings and positioning for various parts of the screen itself, things like colors. But we also need to address the fact that, much like the free play mode, the song editor is going to need to be able to interface with that save screen. Of course, as we go and make changes to any given song, we would like to be able to save those. Mm-hmm. So we are going to need to look at some global state information. Now, granted, a lot of the saving code is already in place. What we're going to do is we will need to be able to hold whether or not edit mode is currently active, because right now we have an interesting scenario where when we go from edit mode, the selection on the main menu, we jump into the songs menu, and from there, the song selection menu has to somehow know whether or not it's loading up the edit screen or loading up the gameplay screen. We're also going to need, later in time, to make some changes to our rendering system to better accommodate editing mode, and that, too, is going to need to know whether or not we are currently looking at editing or currently looking at the game. So we'll need some global information to be put together. We're also going to look at creating an alternate input map dedicated to edit mode. And that will allow us to freely bind any button or key we wish inside of edit mode separately from the rest of the game. And this will let us maximize any buttons or drum pads that may be available to us when setting up the interface for edit mode. Alright, to jump in and get started, we'll first look at our style XML file. Here inside of style, we need to set up the last few colors here inside of our colors section. These are for our edit grid and edit cursor, where edit grid is going to be a grid of notes showing us the places that notes can be added, and the cursor is going to be a highlighted note showing us where a note would be dropped if we hit the create note button. So for our edit grid, let's put down a standard bluish gray. We'll drop down 115 in red and green, and a value of 126 in blue. Then for our edit cursor, we'll do a color of transparent white. That means we'll use 255 for red, green, and blue. Then we'll drop an additional comma so we can gain access to the alpha component and drop in a value of 96 for our alpha. Alright, that's all we need to do here inside of style.xml. We'll save this file out and move over to global state. Here inside of global state, for our song saving and loading, we'll actually be able to directly reuse our existing hold song fields. We'll need to add one additional field, and that's going to be the field that says whether or not edit mode is currently active. Because, of course, we don't have a mechanism for looking at specific screens, and even if we did, we wouldn't want to make the various components of our game be reliant on the existence of a specific screen.
Right.
Instead, we'll define that idea as edit mode, and we'll place that into global state so that way, regardless of screens or other classes, anything in the game is free to look up and see, are we currently in edit mode? We'll actually call this field edit mode active. So this will be a public static Boolean field, which is going to be called edit mode active. And we will set this explicitly to false for its initialization. So what we'll do is we'll let the main menu decide whether or not this field should be left alone, leaving the rest of the game as it currently stands, or changing this so that the moment we enter edit mode from the main menu, we can set this value, and then everything from there on out, whether it be a selection screen or a drawing screen or whatever, or what have you, it can always look to this value and see whether or not edit mode is currently active. Alright, moving on, let's now take a look at our main menu screen. So let's jump here. We currently have screen main open, so let's jump over to it. Here inside of our input pressed method, we're making our decision based on whether or not we have a specific item selected. Now what we'll do is we'll make sure that the moment any item is selected, regardless of what item it is, we'll clear edit mode. So that way if we were to hit single player, multiplayer, or any other mode, we'll make sure that we default to having edit mode set to false. So that means right in here, right after we set the number of players to 1, we'll also set the edit mode active, to be false. And then only if we select edit mode, or our last menu item, will we activate the edit mode. So down here we'll say global state.editModeActive is set to true. This way we don't have to worry about accidentally leaving edit mode active when we move over to something like single player. We'll just leave false be the default. Alright, we're also making sure that before we show the song selection screen, we're setting this to true ahead of time, making sure that edit mode is already active before the song select screen shows, so that it can properly know what to do from that point on. Now we need to look into the song selection screen and make sure that it properly decides which screen to bring up when edit mode is active. So that means we'll jump in here to our menus and bring up our screen select class. Here inside of screen select, we're doing the standard checks. The specific check we're looking for is what happens when the select button is pressed. Currently, that will bring up the game. That's all it does. But we need to make a decision here, because if we're at the song selection screen and the user selects a song, we need to see if the game is in edit mode, because if it's in edit mode, then the edit screen comes up. If we're not in edit mode, then the game screen comes up like normal. So a simple check here will be if global state.editModeActive, then we instead need to push the edit screen. So we'll actually copy the current two lines, push screen game and active screen.reset, and paste those inside of our new if statement, where we will change the actual screen, to be edit. So we'll push the edit screen and then reset that screen. Now for our remaining statements, we'll drop in an else clause, so that if we are not in edit mode, then the original functionality remains, where we just go into gameplay mode. Alright, moving on from here, let's actually set up the edit mode screen, the basics for that class. We'll get the class itself put in place, and we'll make sure that it's able to properly look at input. Again, just getting this set up is kind of a foundation. So what we'll do is here inside of game, we'll add a new class, and we will call this class screen edit. So here inside of our edit screen, we'll take out our sub namespace. We need to put in some using statements, and at the moment I'm feeling lazy, so I'll grab the nearest screen available, so we can grab using statements for framework and graphics. We'll grab those from the select screen. So with these using statements in place, we will also make sure that our edit screen extends screen. So now we have the foundation for this class ready to go, though we do need to remember to instantiate and register it inside of the game class. So we'll bring up game, and we're still looking at the screens section inside of load content. So we will take our save prompt screen and duplicate that line, and we'll register a new screen under the name edit, and the type of screen will be a new instance of screen edit. Now at this point, let's very briefly build and jump into the game so we can make sure that our state and screen information are working so far. So jumping into the game, we'll move down to Song Editor, jump into Song Editor. Now as before, we already had the select screen tied in, so this is nothing new. However, the moment we select any of these songs, we have to make the decision of whether or not we'll pull up edit mode or game mode. So let's select the first song, and we see that the edit screen does indeed load up.
Nice.
So we have our state information working properly there. Now, of course, edit mode has no input handling, which means we're currently stuck at edit mode. So I'll exit and relaunch the game to test the last case, meaning we know if we go into Song Editor, it's at this point that we have set our state to be looking at edit mode active. But let's make sure we can still back up and go into single player and bring up a song.
Nice.
And we are able to bring up a song. So we have all of the state information for selecting edit mode set up correctly. Now there's one last topic we need to address. Again, inside of our edit mode, we would like to have a completely separate set of input bindings. So in order to accomplish this, we're going to bring up our main configuration file. So back here inside of content, if we collapse down our style folder, we can load up config.xml. And of course, here at the end of the config XML file, we have our different input sections, game-specific input and menu-specific input. We're going to add a new section below menu input, and we're going to call this section edit input. So here we can have edit mode specific input bindings. Now for the moment, we're just going to create a few specifics for the gamepad, because at the moment the keyboard has plenty of buttons to do all of the navigation we would need. We have plenty of buttons to use for all of the different drums while still retaining separate buttons like spacebar for reset. On the gamepad controller, we don't have the luxury of that number of buttons. So we're going to reuse some of the buttons that were normally used as drums. Looking at our game input, we can see that the A, B, X, and Y buttons are all various notes. In edit mode, we'd like to have one of those buttons be a note and a different button be reset, where in edit mode we could use reset to do things like seek the song back to the beginning and replay. So we need to reuse one of our input buttons. Now to begin dropping all this in place, let me actually copy one of these lines to start out with, because we are going to do a gamepad bind operation, which means we'll need all the same kinds of input. So we'll drop in one of our existing gamepad bind lines. And currently we'll leave this gamepad set to port 0 because we have one controller connected to the system. We will look at our device input. We'll bind the A button to be our actual note input. So we'll actually leave this as note. We can set the player to 0, though we shouldn't have to worry too much about players inside of edit mode. We won't necessarily add all of our player respecting code in place. So really, this is very similar to gameplay mode. We're essentially just duplicating the device input for A. Now I'm going to take this line here in edit input, duplicate it an additional time, and we'll make a separate binding for the X button. We'll say that X is not going to be a note. It is instead going to be the reset input. And we'll leave player set to 0 and data set to 0. So in this way, we can be inside of edit mode, where the X button will allow us to replay a song, as opposed to game where the X button is just another drum.
Okay.
So this is all very simple from the config file side of things. Now we need to go into the actual config class and make sure that we set up an appropriate field and loading operation to take this new section into account. So what we'll do is we'll jump down here inside of game and bring up our config class. Now if we scroll up a little bit, we see we have different map set fields to hold the different map bindings. We're going to take our last field, the menu maps field, and duplicate it so we can make a third map set field, and we'll call this field edit maps. So we have a completely separate map set that we will use for edit mode. Now we'll move down to our load input section, where we need to begin by instantiating the new edit maps field. So we'll jump in here and say that edit maps will be equal to a new instance of map set. Now we need to make sure that the appropriate inputs get loaded into edit maps. Now we'll follow the same method we were using before, where everything in global input goes into all of the maps, including our edit maps. So we'll duplicate the last line for loading global input into menu maps, and instead point this at the appropriate field for edit maps. So that means edit maps right off the bat will also get everything that's inside of global input. Now we need to load out the specific stuff that was in that new section we created inside of the config file. That means we need to look at the edit input section and drop this also into edit maps. So everything in global into edit, and then the specifics from edit input into edit.
Gotcha.
Now that'll take care of getting the map set itself loaded up. We need to make sure that that edit map set is put into place as soon as the edit screen comes up for play. So what we'll do is we'll take one quick trip back to our new screen edit class, and we'll add a simple override for process show. So here inside of process show, we can take out our base process show call, and instead we'll put in a call to input.change mapset. We'll use this to get the edit mode mapping put into place. So we're going to change to the map set found in config edit.editMaps. And that way we'll have all of our edit bindings set up and ready for use inside of the edit screen.
And we don't have to do anything special for the keyboard, do we?
Not at the moment. Once we get into edit mode itself, really we're doing very little in the configuration at the moment because we need to put the functionality into the edit screen so we have an idea of exactly what we'll be binding to.
Okay.
We're just getting this framework in place so that the moment we decide that we need a new button that needs to be separate, dedicated to edit mode, we can easily set that up from the configuration file.
Right.
But with that, let's build, make sure that everything builds, that we don't have any errors. Everything seems to have built just fine. At the moment, we're not going to test because, again, we're seeing the exact same screen. All we're doing is loading up our separate map set.
Yeah, there'd be nothing to see.
So again, this has just been a foundational setup lesson where we are preparing for edit mode. So we've got our style colors set up, we've got edit mode set up in global state, we've got input handling that allows us to navigate to the edit screen, and we have a dedicated input mapping set up and ready to go. So with that, that's going to take care of this video.